Well, Philip Ackerman Leist, welcome to the Local Food Summit. It's a great privilege to have you join us here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks so much, Michael. I really look forward to the conversation.
Where are you speaking from this morning, Philip?
Speaking from my office here at Green Mountain College, in my office, which is actually part of the farmhouse here at the farm complex. So I've got a great view out as everybody else is working, and I'm in here talking. It's
A farmhouse. Tell us. So, give us a picture of what's happening with Green Mountain College and local food.
Sure. And I think Green Mountain College represents some of what happened throughout the United States. The college has had a college farm since its inception. In fact, early on, 185 years ago, had 3 farms at one point, and that was part of the campus infrastructure, and it was also part of the campus food system, obviously. And there was even a barter system going for tuition back in those days when some folks were bartering cows, milk, eggs, all kinds of things early on. So we've got right now it's 23 acres of organic management here that we've got here at the college farm. The farmhouse is, as it should be, the centerpiece. And so we have the offices here where I am, but we also have something that's fairly unique, and I hope is not so unique in a couple of years, is a certified community kitchen that we have, which trains our students in best practices for doing value-added products, culinary experiments, and is also an incubator for local businesses that want to come in at a very reduced rate, as well as for also the local food bank folks to utilize for free. So it's really a neat nexus point for the community and the college.
So what's your role at Green Mountain College?
Yeah, so I restarted the college farm back 20 years ago. As many places did in the United States, the college gave up its college farm and just leased it out just after World War II, and everything changed in the dining hall. They'd even had raw milk, in the dining hall prior to that, which is amazing. And so I stepped in here and started the college farm, and after that got rolling and the students were really fantastic in helping pick that up and run with it, then we established an undergraduate major in sustainable agriculture, which now is the largest major at the college. It's sustainable agriculture and food systems. We intentionally put that food systems piece on the end.
Great.
And then I also started it was a graduate program, an online program in sustainable food systems, which was the first online graduate program in sustainable food systems in the country. So in a neat spot where they allow us to be creative.
Yeah, excellent. So give us a little picture of your own trajectory into all of this. How did you get involved in local food systems work?
Yeah, well, it's a long trajectory if we've got time, but I'll shorten it a bit. Cut that arc down just a touch. But my grandfather was a plant pathologist in North Carolina, and was eager to find a way to build out the local economy in the Carolinas and Georgia, and started working on the peach industry and trying to build the peach industry in that area. So I was in the footsteps of my grandfather for quite a few years, just in the work that he was doing there in North Carolina. But I was also looking for some sort of agriculture that was somewhat different. I was lucky enough to land in the Alps, where I was farming there for several years, and there finding a more small-scale diversified agriculture that really appealed to me, but nonetheless spraying pesticides in that scenario. And so after several years of being in a rubber suit and respirator, came back to the United States to try to unpack this whole question of organic agriculture and what were the possibilities. So landed here at Green Mountain College, and we started building out the programs, and at the same time started my own farm with my wife Erin, where we do grass-fed beef using a heritage breed of American milking Devon cattle.
So you are a bona fide farmer and academic.
Right. I don't know if they want me in either camp, but I'm in those worlds in between. Yeah.
It's kind of a rare combination, but you're clearly in an unusual situation in Vermont there. And speaking of which, I saw that the 2017 Locavore Index was published this week.
Yep, I just caught that as well.
Really interesting. I became aware of the Locavore Index in 2013, and at that time, Colorado was number 19, and we've now, well, we slipped last year down to number 35. We're up to 33 this year, but it's one of the Locavore Index is one of the few indicators that we have of where we are in local food system development across the country. And of course, Vermont is still number one.
Always like to keep that status if we can.
I finally realized that the entire state population of Vermont is about the same as the city of Denver here in Colorado.
Yeah.
So it gave me a little bit of perspective. Yeah. Really interesting. So since it was just published this week, I don't know if you've had a chance to digest it, but I'm interested in what you're seeing in the latest Locavore Index.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Vermont is listed there as number one, and Maine as number two, and I think there's certainly some similarities in the states. Both of those states and the other states that are listed there in the top five, and I think there are some commonalities as you look at those top states. We're all states in which we have a highly relational political system. Where we are small enough in terms of population and people that we can get around and we can have an impact by way of conversations. I think that makes a big difference. There's a lot of transparency, that's involved by virtue of the size and scale of farms, that I think helps in many cases. And, and people, we live and breathe this landscape. And so it's something that we want to invest in. And so it's very palpable, that kind of investment it speaks to the future, but also to the past.
Yes. So from what you can see in your really unique position in Vermont at Green Mountain College, how do you feel we're doing as a nation in food localization? You published Rebuilding the Food Shed in 2013, and I'm sure it took at least a couple of years to write that book, but you've been watching this and paying close attention for some time. What do you see about where we are now?
Yeah, well, I think I've just been very privileged to be part of a lot of different conversations, there with you in Boulder and other places, and to hear the different conversations that were coming out over time. I think it's a positive trajectory. And I think, when we look at it sort of from the overarching federal perspective, it's a little bit daunting and overwhelming. And, one can feel good about the numbers in terms of local food sales. We still are on a really nice positive trajectory there. The trend line is good, although the percentage remains quite small.
Quite small.
And yet, when those dollars trickle down into very local economies, they can have a pretty hefty impact. So I think the towns, the counties, the communities that are really paying attention are capitalizing on this. And they are not only seeing it as an economic development opportunity, they're actually seeing economic development happening. And those numbers are there. And the fact that those numbers are real and solid means that it's even easier to get folks from all across the political spectrum to come together and have these conversations. It's one thing that people don't shoot at from the political sidelines quite as readily.
It's hard to be against local food.
It is. A few have figured out a way to do it.
Yeah, apparently. Well, I've heard it, especially among big ag and big food. I've heard local food kind of marginalized and belittled, but tolerated.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
In Rebuilding the Food Shed, you spoke of a couple of levels of conversation around local food. One was local food 1.0, which was maybe the feel-good marketing outreach aspect of this, yeah. And you saw the emergence of a campfire conversation that you called Local Food 2.0. Could you talk to us a little bit about that? Explain Local Food 2.0.
Sure. And I think we all come to this in different ways. And a lot of us, certainly myself, came to it by way of the local food discussion, thinking of local food products. And many of us, like myself, sort of stopped thinking at the farm gates, and didn't make our way all the way to the dinner plate. And suddenly we realized that it was incumbent upon us that we had to actually take that next step. And that step does involve a lot of those campfire conversations where we sit down and we hash out, the food system, this thing that goes from farm gate all the way to dinner plate and even beyond, now even to, nutrient management, past that dinner plate cycle. So we really have, I think we've started to see the full circle, the full cycle, and brought that into the local foods conversation. So that for me is really exciting. You've got to be careful whenever academics grab a word like food systems. We can take it in the wrong direction sometimes, but I think in this case, we really are, so far, we're treating that very seriously and understanding that we've got to get at all these different points in the food system in order to rebuild a very complex system, but also there's the community basis that goes along with it.
Yes.
And there's also a democracy element that I think is very interesting as we try to think about these food systems too.
Yeah. Well, the concept of food shed and food system are actually, it seems to me they haven't quite become part of the mainstream vernacular.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But infiltrating a little bit. I just recently had a conversation with Jack Kloppenberg,
Great.
who wrote, Coming into the Food Shed now many years ago. It's great to hear from him, and it seems like we still very often when we talk about food shed, people ask, well, what's a food shed?
Mm-hmm.
Just like when we talk about food hubs, people say, well, what's a food hub? And I think,
Yep.
Gosh. So these are concepts that are slowly making their way into the public conversation. But what we're really pointing to here is seeing food from a systemic perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing local food beginning to develop this systemic approach or a food shed approach.
Yeah.
So one of the things that occurs to me to ask you, because I know other people are curious, how is it that Vermont has gotten as far as you have? I mean, you're now at, I'm thinking close to 10% local food. Is that correct?
Depends on the measure you use. 7% is a safe number, and it could be higher. It depends on who you're talking to. For those numbers, and there's some that put it at closer to 10%.
But percentage-wise, that's quite a bit far beyond, I think, anybody else. Certainly, the rest of the country in aggregate. So, tell us a little bit about how Vermont has gotten to this level, what you see in the future, and what we can learn from Vermont's experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was kind of an interesting story that happened here in Vermont, at least as I saw it unfold. There was, now it's been probably, trying to remember which year that was. It was 2006, 2007. The Vermont Sustainable Agriculture Council was beginning to have these discussions about where were we in terms of local foods and not having a measurement. And there was a young man, a graduate student at UVM at the time, Dave Timmons, who's now a PhD down in Massachusetts. Mm. And Dave did the first measure. And as he started to look at it, he saw that it looked like it was close to 5%. And all of us in that group were astounded at that point in time that we were there. And clearly it was more than double where any other state was, as far as we could tell at that point in time.
Right.
And so once we had that realization, and then the legislators started paying attention, and certainly the Agency of Agriculture and UVM Extension, a lot of folks started to really look at that number and start to think, well, how can we expand on that? Because really what we'd done at that point, it was a lot of the low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
And so the low-hanging fruit was there. It was based off of a lot of years of work, of organic farmers and others, and certainly the dairy industry, Cabot and others had done a good job here. But the next question was, how do we take it further? And what was happening at that point in time around the state, many of us in different regions were sort of, we were creating what I call these sort of food system fiefdoms in a way, different places. And a lot of us had similar ideas. And of course, we were vying for our own regions. And the philanthropists in the state, they actually put the brakes on funding for a short period of time. They said, this is not strategic and people aren't aligned. And so they actually said, what we'd like to do, we don't want to fund a lot more of this until we figure out where we're headed. So they helped provide some of the funding for bringing the players together. And so that happened in Rutland. We brought about 350 stakeholders together from all over the state, including the governor, the secretary of ag, anyone who wanted to show up and tried to represent the full food system. And at that point started to embark upon this path of creating the Farm to Plate Network, which had a 10-year strategic plan associated with it, with these very real targets of trying to build it out.
10-year plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what year was that?
Boy, I may get it wrong, Michael. I think this was happening around 2007, 2008,
Okay.
This building process. The legislature tossed in some funding at the beginning to pull us all together, help us figure out how to do this. And the really neat thing about it is, that now it's started to happen in other states as well. Other states picked up on this. And so that's exciting. And now it's even gone from, this statewide plan, which supports the local plan, to a regional plan, so that the secretaries of agriculture across the Northeast are talking together, trying to figure out how we work this. We've all got fairly similar issues, and we've got this enormous land base that surrounds these major urban centers.
Yes.
And so it takes a lot of coordination. If we want to rebuild that in such a way that the dollars flow back to the communities, that there's more democracy involved, that it's the kind of agriculture that we want to see on our landscapes. That's not something that we just let happen, by some invisible hand, which others have mentioned previously in our history.
Yes. So what states are involved regionally now?
So right now, I believe the conversations are happening with New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. There was some conversation, I think maybe Pennsylvania has been drawn in. And so, and that's always a question, is how far do you go and who do you include and who do you exclude?
Right.
In these conversations.
Well, I believe I saw just recently somebody came back from a conference back east and brought with them the 50 by 60 New England food vision.
Mm-hmm. Yep. With Food Solutions New England. And
it's pretty inspiring to see.
Mm-hmm. It is, and it's aggressive in terms of its vision. And I think, that's one of the interesting questions for me. And I haven't come out kind of on one side or the other is, we have to celebrate small successes. I mean, that's very clear. And then we, to some degree, we have to be audacious in our goals. And yet, how audacious are we? Because the big failures are much more of an issue for us than just having small successes. So I think it's always interesting to figure out, where are the thresholds and what's possible, because we have gotten a lot of that that low-hanging fruit. And so I think that's one of the questions that we're facing is now, as we step it up, now we're talking about infrastructure. We're talking about a lot more bricks and mortar. We're talking about businesses, about investment, about millions of dollars. And it's not the easy stuff anymore.
Yeah, that's right. That's certainly what we're experiencing here in the Rocky Mountain region. It's been wonderful to see all the new farming, young people coming in, the fantastic growth of CSAs and farmers markets and all of that. But we've also seen that kind of flatten out over the last 2 or 3 years, and some are saying that even direct marketing is declining measurably in Colorado. So we're bumping up against these bigger issues of building infrastructure. And that's new territory.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's very difficult. We're familiar with a group of farmers that came together to form a co-op, and they even built a food hub, to
Hmm.
get their produce to the Denver market, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Seemed like a great idea, a wonderful thing, but they ran into problems of capital.
Mm-hmm.
How do you can get initial funding fairly
Yep.
easily, but
Yeah.
how do you maintain that when it takes maybe 6 to 8 years for such a venture to become profitable?
Yep.
And then they ran into the problem of management, and the first thing that they learned was most farmers don't make good business managers, right?
Yeah, right. That can be tricky. Yeah.
Then they discovered that they also weren't very good at hiring outside managers. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting, the challenges that we're running into now. And while there are certainly conversations like that are happening, there are very few yet where people are coming together looking at this from a systemic level
Mm-hmm.
to see how we can address some of these larger issues. I mean, even the issue of capital, how we move what we know is going to be many millions of dollars just to get to the next level of infrastructure. Nobody has answers yet.
Yeah, it's really a tough one, and I think one of the things I'm really interested in after traveling around these past few years is the ownership model. And we
Yes.
have the NGO approach, we have the cooperative approach, and then we have the private enterprise approach, and all
Yes.
of those have their advantages and disadvantages. And in some ways, those advantages and disadvantages shift over time in the development, of the organization. I find that to be really interesting and challenging, and also,
Yeah.
frankly, the place where the wrong decisions can lead to the breakdown in the long run. And,
I think you're right. We see the question come up again and again in various communities. Who is leading the effort towards food localization? Who
mhm,
should take that on?
mhm.
And where does it reside? And of course, there are lots of people who want to volunteer for that position, but including local governments, but it's not always appropriate. And the conversations where those kinds of fundamental questions are addressed and decided, I think are really, really important.
Yeah, I think so too. And I have to do a tip of the hat, excuse me, a tip of the hat to Ellen Kaler here with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. Because
Yeah.
I was asking that question and early on with the Sustainable Ag Council, and really saying someone has to own this. Someone has to, be the proprietor of this initiative. And I was questioning, well, should it be the State Agency of Agriculture? Should it be UVM Extension? Who is it going to be? And Ellen came back and put something forward that I sort of I didn't scoff at it, but I didn't buy it. And it was this notion of the social network, and really
Hmm.
creating a network approach to the strategy, which is what the entire Vermont Farm to Plate initiative now is, the Vermont Farm to Plate Network. And she picked that up from REAMP, which was an initiative to battle coal-fired power plants
Oh
in
yeah.
the West. And so took that model and then brought it to Vermont with the help of some other folks. And it's been really powerful. It's not a perfect model, but neither are the others. And I have to say, I think it's been highly successful.
Hmm.
So it's more of a coordinating role than it is an ownership. And that has made a difference. And it's also been viable in a state of this size.
Yes. Right. Well, it's we're certainly struggling with it here in Colorado and the whole Rocky Mountain region. So that we can safely say that we are in the very early stages of rebuilding our food shed
Yeah.
here.
Great. Yeah, we're all really in those beginning stages, I think, in many ways. And and that's one of the questions, I guess. And we've discussed this too, is how do we maintain that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's the work not even of a generation, it's of several generations.
I think that's a very important realization. It was a painful one for us because when we started, we started in this work. It's been about 12 years ago, and along the way, we set an informal aspirational goal of getting to 25% local food in Colorado, starting with Boulder County. And it seemed like we ought to be able to do that in a decade, but a decade later, we see that we've barely moved the needle, and that doesn't mean, as sometimes people will conclude, that we're failing. It means that this is just a much bigger project that's going to take a lot longer than we had imagined.
Yeah, and I just hope we can continue to encourage folks to put their shoulder behind it and do this over the long haul. And but I do see the younger generation wanting to do that. I mean, it's actually it's reaffirming to work with so many young people and see that energy and enthusiasm. But there is a reality check that's waiting for them. It's one thing to talk about it in the classroom. It's another to get out there and just see how darn hard it is to make things happen.
It certainly here, I'm sure it's an issue there as well, maybe to a lesser extent here, but the biggest challenge those young people face is where can they find land to farm? Access to land is just really, really difficult.
Yeah, for us, I think building the capital to do that is a real challenge. And the alums that we've had from Green Mountain College who've gone out and been successful in the farming, usually they're out for 5 to 7 years before they've gathered together the starting capital, and it's almost always $250,000 or more that they need to make this happen. But we've had great partners with Vermont Land Trust and others in doing that. But the other two issues too, I think, are significant. One is health insurance.
Yes.
They're stepping out. That's an enormous piece and a dangerous profession as they're trying to figure that out. And then frankly, it's also student loans. And so I think it's incumbent upon higher education to figure a way to help educate people. And I think what we can do that does make sense is we can accelerate the education and we can deepen it, but we can't saddle these folks with, debt that's just such a weight that they can't get out from under it.
Yeah.
It's a real quandary.
It is. And the other side of it is that we're seeing here, as I'm sure you are there, a surprising number of young people who show up on the scene who are absolutely driven to do this, and they understand that they are called to this work. This is why they're on the planet.
Right. Yeah.
That's very exciting, and it's hard not to want to help those people.
It really is. And I, sometimes I find myself in the ironic position of, certainly I don't want to squelch the idealism, but I do, part of my job is to help temper it so that they are well prepared as they step out, because it's not going to get any easier. But, it's pretty amazing seeing what they're doing. They are successful, and that's tremendously rewarding, but it takes a lot. And it means an educator doesn't just have them in the classroom. I think we try to keep those relationships going over the long haul and watch and work with them. And then those networks, as they go out, those also become educational networks and support
Absolutely.
Networks. It's kind of a neat spider web.
We know a couple here up in Fort Collins who've been farming for the last 8 years. They started from scratch. He left an engineering position and recruited a young woman to be his wife and co-farmer. And without having any financial resources whatsoever, they dove into it full time, and it was certainly difficult for the first several years, but they've become quite successful leasing various plots of small plots of land, from 2 to 5 acres. They're all roughly in the same area. And I knew that they were onto something a couple of years ago when I saw that they were able to buy a house
Wow.
They bought a new tractor. They have 401ks. They have health insurance. They had a new baby. This is very
Wow.
encouraging.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
And their annual sales have been growing, and to a level. I mean, they don't like to reveal what they're doing, but what they're demonstrating is this is not easy, but it's definitely possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well, and I don't think, starting any kind of a small business is never easy. And,
sure.
farming, you get all the vacillations of weather and other markets and other things. But it's just incredibly exciting and invigorating to see how much success there is out there, and then how much potential there still is.
Indeed. Well, speaking of small successes, you have discovered a small success, but very meaningful over in Italy.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to tell us how you came across this story, and tell us what's happening.
Yeah, well, there's this small town which is comprised of 11 different villages. So it's a township, a municipality called Maltz, in the South Tyrol region of Italy. So that's Mals, or in Italian, it's Malles Venosta. And
Ah, so
really,
this is near the Alps?
yep, it's in the Alps. It's literally it's the township that's at the intersection of Austria, Switzerland, and Italy.
Oh,
So,
okay.
right in that corner.
So is
And
this near where you were in the Alps years
it
ago?
is, yeah,
Oh,
and that's sort of the irony of it for me is, this was the place where I was living, working, farming, and spraying pesticides in the vineyard and and then I was back leading a group of graduate students in 2014,
mm,
and having breakfast with a friend and asking where we should go, what we should see. And she said, "Well, there's in Maltz, which you know where that is." And I said, "Sure." She said, "Well, they're about to have a referendum next week to ban all pesticides." And that's all agricultural pesticides as well as all other pesticides.
mm.
And as of course, I said, "Well, we're going there." So we hired a small bus from a bus company that's there in the area, and I drove up with the graduate students and met with one of the folks who was initiating this referendum. And so I watched it, and the referendum unfolded 2 weeks after we left. And as it turned out, they had 69% participation of the local populace in the referendum, and over 75% of the people voted in favor of what they called a pesticide-free township. And which, as far as we've been able to tell anywhere in the world, it's the first place that's done that. There
Wow.
are
Yeah.
places that have done it with one class of pesticides, or maybe cosmetic pesticides, or maybe they just do it on municipal grounds. But this was really a daring move in a place where monoculture and the pesticides associated with it
Yeah.
are taking over.
So what precipitated this? I mean, this is a pretty bold outbreak of democracy here.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it is, it's a story of it's about pesticides. It's also about direct democracy. It's
Mm,
also about a group of citizen activists, who never saw themselves, certainly not being on the world stage, but really never saw themselves as being folks who would take on the forces that they decided to take on.
yeah.
And so what was happening, it was sort of a conspiracy of climate change, wealth in one particular industry, that is the Apple industry,
Hmm.
and what you might call land grabbing as well from the outside. And so as climate change has shifted and apple production has been able to move further and further up in elevation, the apple monocultures or apple monoculture has pushed further and further up into this high elevation township. And they've seen what's happened down valley, if you will. It's quite clear they've just been taken over by the Apple industry.
Mm.
And they said, we don't want that. This place was the breadbasket of the Tyrol for many years. And so they're trying to really hold on to that agricultural heritage, and decided to stand together and, really to think differently from everyone else around them. It's pretty astonishing.
So how did that get organized? I mean, give us an idea of the population involved there, and maybe how what was the spark? How did things get organized?
Yeah, so the real spark. I mean, they all saw this marching up the valley, and they could see
Yeah,
it coming, and they could smell it coming, literally. With the pesticide drift
yeah,
as
yeah.
coming up. But they knew that was coming. But then there was an organic dairy farmer, Gunther Wallnerfer, who had his organic dairy. He has it there in the town, and he had an apple orchard show up on one side of his fields, his pastures and meadows, and then another apple orchard came in on the other side. And so he had to get his hay tested to see if there were any pesticide residues. And of course, the buffer at that point in time was 3 meters. That was all that was required by law.
Wow, wow.
So he had his hay tested, found out that he had to dispose of his hay because it was tainted.
Mm.
He did that for the next 2 cuttings, had to dispose of that hay, buy in new hay. And so he was the one who went to the mayor and said, what do I do here? This is just, there's so many of us are trying to be organic farmers now. And here we are in this situation where we're getting shut down by virtue of drift. It's not something we did, it's something
Yes,
we're dealing with.
right.
So for me, one of the interesting things, particularly after writing Rebuilding the Food Shed, is this question of local and organic, which,
Mm.
you and I have talked about this some. I mean, I've always been a little nervous about this notion of local trumping organic. And as even, I believe it was on Newsweek, but certainly it hit the media that local had trumped organic. And I think we were making a mistake. It was a nice media play, but I think we goofed. And a case like this, a scenario like this really sort of is testament to that.
Although I'm guessing that the apple production, the conventional apple production that was taking place there, that was not for local food. That was all for export, was it not?
Yeah, some for local, but you're exactly right. So 1 out of every 7 apples that you eat in Europe will come from the South Tyrol. And there
Right,
was a large
right.
Russian market as well before a couple summers ago. So yeah, exactly. And so now they're trying to find other markets for export. So that became a real quandary. And by virtue of what they were doing, you had these local apples, which you could get, but then it was pushing out all the other possibilities, of what you
Right,
could get
right.
instead. So the Midwest certainly has interesting parallels, in that case.
Yeah, well, and I think that this is something that will be discussed by many people in the local food summit, is
Hmm.
this quandary between local and organic. And we have just come to the place, it goes back to, know your farmer.
Hmm. Yep.
That's the most important thing. And
Yeah.
we've seen that. I've never met any farmer who is focused on producing food for local people who will use pesticides or anything like that. They just
Mm-hmm.
won't do it. I mean, because they know they wouldn't do that for food for their kids.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that does vary in place to place. And,
probably.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Starts to be a bit of a question. And I think, too, I think we confuse the issue sometimes of organic certification and organic management. And this was the conversation in my class a few weeks ago. And, so I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, everyone has to be organic certified, but it sure would be nice for us to move more and more toward organic management and adopt this reality that, we're talking about transition here, a word that
Yes.
is
Right.
close to your heart and mind, but it's how do we transition, toward this, and how do we dangle enough of those local carrots in front of folks, and organic carrots to kind of bring them along into this world.
So I want to come back to the story of what happened in Malt. So this farmer went to the mayor,
Yep.
and
Yep.
what happened from there?
Yeah. So then, he realized that this was, he and the mayor both realized this was going to be something that was going to be fairly complex. They didn't
Mm.
realize quite how intense things were going to become, as they tried to move this up the ladder through the provincial officials. And so what they discovered there was that in the EU and also in Italy, a mayor has the right to do what is necessary to protect his or her citizens in terms of health. And so that made all the difference in the world as they started to advance this forward. So they started off with this conversation about banning all pesticides.
Mm.
Then there was a group of women who stepped into the conversation, after things were rolling for about a year and a half. And one of them, Pia Oswald, said, let's not make this negative. Let's turn this into a positive campaign. She said, let's not use the words no, don't, not, anti, and instead let's talk about a pesticide-free future for all. And who can argue against that?
Yeah.
And I think that is brilliant. And that is part of the reason that so many people fell in behind this conversation. And so they began to advance forward. There were lots of different groups that were doing different things and trying to educate folks. They had more than 20 public dialogues, bringing in experts from all over Europe, to educate people about pesticides, to have the debates. Tried to open up those debates, so that there were more. So there were some apple farmers, conventional farmers, and otherwise other folks there. So over time, they spent about 2 years working on this and on those issues before they decided that a referendum would be the way to go. But the other thing they did that was fascinating to me, Michael, was they created a manifesto. And, a manifesto, may or may not have any given weight. But what they did was they went to everyone with a PhD, an MD, any kind of a doctorate there in the area and had them sign on, and got almost every doctor, dentist, veterinarian, biologist, all of those folks to sign on to the manifesto with a quote of why they were supporting the manifesto. And it was brilliant, because that gave it the oomph and the lift, and it didn't make it look like it was a bunch of green crazies, as one of them called it. That they really had the weight of science behind them as well.
Very interesting.
Really fascinating.
So, a couple of things about this. First of all, what's the size of Maltz? How many people?
About 5,300 people.
Wow.
Scattered over 90 square miles so in these different villages that are surrounded around the main village of Maltz itself.
Okay. So really very, very small, very rural.
Yep.
And so my impression from when I first heard about this story was that the women of the community played a really strong role in this.
They did. Yeah, it was really amazing. The women saw, after things were rolling out, that the media wasn't paying enough attention to the issue. And so it was pretty interesting, the approach they took. They did two things that really started to move things along. First, they did a letter to the editor, and they started to circulate that so that they got as many people to submit the letter to the editor at the very same time. And so that they were printed in the local media all at once. And that was asking the mayor essentially to protect the health of the citizens in the area, which was a smart political move. And then the next thing that they did was, and it was really sort of this furtive stealth approach. Because they also have a lot of agritourism there and sustainable tourism. They also have a lot of bed sheets that are there for all the hotels and the small places. So they turned the bed sheets into banners, and so they secretly created these banners. And overnight, literally in one night, everybody went out after dark and hung them up all throughout these different villages. And, it was appealing to the mayor and others for a pesticide-free community.
Wow.
And of course, then they started to grab the media, and they started to grab more of the heat. But they got things so far down the road that the local officials and the apple industry, they weren't taking them seriously, and they didn't soon enough. And so they forged ahead in this referendum. And now Europe, actually the EU, has adopted a pesticide-free village initiative based on Maltz.
Oh, wow.
This is the discussion now, is the creation of pesticide-free villages throughout Europe. And that's why I was back there just last week, was because the Pesticide Action Network of Europe, they gathered together in Maltz to strategize for the next couple of years and what they're doing. And they wanted to see the realities, because Maltz really is this preeminent story internationally, but also for Europe as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
At what point did you decide that you wanted to write a book about this?
Yeah, once I saw what had happened, and I wrote an article for Truth Out right after the referendum passed, and just started talking to people again, took another group of graduate students the following year. And at that point invited Douglas Gayton from the Lexicon of Sustainability to join me.
Yes.
And so Douglas came along, and what we decided to do was visit as many of those farms and also the processors, all the people who are involved in the food system that we could possibly meet. travel around and document their part of the story after the referendum had come out. And so Douglas and I have been working together ever since on this project that we call Toppling Goliath, which we have a
Toppling
website.
Goliath.
Yeah, so that's the story of our times, or at least we want it to be.
There is a website for Toppling Goliath?
TopplingGoliath.org.
Okay.
And then we're working on some short films that go along with that. We have a pop-up show, which features Douglas's information artworks.
Yeah.
Where essentially, it's an artistic approach to telling the story of malts, but also telling the absurdity of what happens when there's the domination of pesticides, monocultures, and certain interests that don't allow for, diverse, sustainable agriculture. So we unveiled that show 2 weeks ago.
And when will the book be published?
Book comes out in October, and the films we're hoping to finish here pretty soon. We're still working on those pieces, and so the pop-up show is starting to move around Europe this summer, and then we'll bring it to the States and start traveling around with the pop-up show and the book in November at that point.
And what's the title of the book?
Well, we're still working on it, so I can tell you in another week or two.
Oh, okay.
And it's an interesting question. I mean, here we have this international precedent, for this particular story, and I think part of it is making sure people understand this isn't just a story about a small town in Italy. This really is a story of our time in many ways. It's about direct democracy, which certainly feels interesting and appealing at this point, given what's going on with our federal government that seems to be slipping from our fingers.
Is there a title that you're leaning towards?
Oh boy!
As the author?
We'll see where this goes. So Margot and folks at Chelsea Green are kind of working through it, and we're trying to choose the title that really is going to make sense for the American public. To really grab the attention. And so, it's certainly a story which we face in the United States about, this David and Goliath scenario where, there's a community taking on big ag.
Right.
And so there's something in there. And we're working for the right title at this point.
Got it. Okay. So so this is a very exciting, inspiring story, obviously. But the other side of it is, why hasn't this happened before? Why hasn't this happened here in this country?
Yeah. It's a hard one, and I think when you start to do this, you take on all kinds of different vested interests. Some of those are political, some of them are corporate, and a lot of it is really challenging the legal system, in the way that it stands. And so it has happened in certain ways around the country, although in Maine has actually had a number of communities that have tried to figure out ways to take on pesticide issues. And again, sometimes cosmetic pesticides, sometimes a certain class of pesticides, or sometimes on municipal properties. Mm-hmm. But just last week, there was the national story that popped out that the state of Maine is now trying to squelch all local pesticide laws. And and that on one hand it's disheartening. On the other hand, we just know that's the game that is going to be played, and it's going to be played out for a while. So it is happening around the country, but no one has ever actually tackled it quite like malts has. So I think it's really interesting to see, and their story isn't done. I mean, they're being challenged, things are being litigated, but it's a story of hope, I think, and a story of perseverance. Yes. And it's also a reminder that doing the right thing, just as it is with local food systems, it takes so much time and so much work. And again, it's the work and the vigilance of a generation that we've got to, utilize in this case.
So I'm curious about what's been the reaction of the apple growers, the conventional apple growers there. How have they been responding to this, and what's their outlook for the future?
Well, when I left, they were livid. They're circulating word that I wasn't a professor and I was being paid for by private citizens there.
I see.
Yeah, it's which is what you expect, but it's good. It means that the issue is gaining traction. They were very, very nervous about the international attention that they had with the
Yeah.
Pesticide Action Network gathering in malts. And when you have a place like that has agriculture and apples as a part of the economy, but the larger part of the economy is tourism. So far, those two have been able to coexist in some fashion, but it's so intense now that that's really coming into question. So they're really hammering hard in terms of litigation. And they, even on their own scale, like some of the multinational corporations, it's a game of words. For example, instead of talking about pesticides now, they talk about crop protection. Instead of talking about, the use of pesticides and IPM, it becomes integrated agriculture, which sounds good. But then you start to look at it and all the impacts and start to question it. So, but there again, they've got the power in so many ways. They've got the money behind them. They've got the media, they've got the politicians. But that's when the game begins to be fun. We'll see if they, but you don't want to be worn down. But I think we've got a horizontal kind of approach now that we can take as communities where, the internet is amazing in what it can do, just as you're doing now. That how do we leverage that power? And it's not about alternative facts. It's about, putting forward these real facts in ways that that not only try to solve the issues that are right in front of us, but also give others hope. It's sharing our stories and sharing the challenges, sharing the failures too. I wish we didn't always have to do that, but the failures matter as much as the successes sometimes.
Well, we have to learn everything we can about doing this. There's so much to learn, and it feels like there's a lot of pressure. And I'll come back to that question about pressure in a minute. But I wanted to ask if any of the conventional apple growers there are giving up, deciding that they're going to get out of the business.
Not so much getting out of the business. I mean, some are taking the route of litigation, or else, just trying to push from whatever angle they can. Some are actually shifting to organic, which is exciting. And when they did a poll of these conventional farmers who are a member of the SBB, which is the local, it's sort of the Farm Bureau equivalent in the region, I believe it was about 65% of the members said that they were interested in organic agriculture. So that's not to say they're going that way, but at least they were open to that conversation.
Yeah.
And, there's a price point there that matters, that could be of interest to them. And if the international markets fail, as at some point, there's going to be a collapse, or at least there'll be that downward spiral at some point.
Right.
So it's a nice way to provide a little bit of a cushion there.
Yeah. Even though there's a significant transition period from conventional to organic.
Right. And then once
is there a market for transitional crops?
Yeah, well, that's one of the interesting things that that malts has done is, and they're dealing with this, grappling with this local organic question. So they had to develop several ordinances as a result of as a result of the referendum, and what they did do actually, that I should point out, that was really it was subtle and sly. They did, before they did any of this, they made those referendums binding. And so that the town council, the municipality, had to actually deal with it, which was really smart, in doing that first before things got politicized. So they developed these ordinances. And so two of the things that I think are really interesting in the ordinances are, one is they're trying to provide resources for farmers to transition. And the other is they're also trying to build out the local economy for organic. And one of the ways they're doing that is they're starting with the kindergartens and serving only organic food in the kindergartens. Then they're trying to go through the rest of the school system there. But they're able to pay a lot more. They choose to pay a lot more for the food in the school system, which also makes that easier than it does here in the United States. So they see that this is a local economic development opportunity. And
Yes.
that this isn't just it's not just a referendum. It's not just a political issue. In the end, if it's going to be successful, it has to be successful economically, or the politics don't matter.
Right. Right. So, what if you could sort of summarize the lessons that you see that are relevant here in the United States from this story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one certainly just is there is hope, for when a group of concerned citizens gather together, whether or not they're quote unquote trained as activists or not. If there are issues that are close to the heart and they really make sense for the next generation, then people can and will come together. I think
Mm.
that people, it makes a lot of sense to look at other communities to glean whatever lessons they can, from those. I think trying to, approach these things from a direct democracy perspective, is very powerful,
Yes.
and important. And it's also, we don't always do a good job of this, and maybe maybe it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, but these things are complex, and the fact that they brought in so many scientists to lay out the issues from so many different perspectives. And so it doesn't matter if this is dealing with safe water resources or pesticides or anything else. Giving the public the opportunity to understand the science,
Mm.
and or the economics, I think, is particularly critical. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of hope in all of this, and the folks in Maltz really, they show us a path forwards, and that there is this possibility of moving a community forward in ways the community never even expected of itself.
Well, it's very inspiring, and certainly look forward to reading the book and
Great.
seeing it be received. Wish you the greatest of success with the book.
Thank you so
Uh,
much, Michael.
have you thought of what the next book is?
Yeah, there are probably too many ideas, and if I were to tell this publicly, my wife would find out, and then I'd be. But I didn't stress out on this book too much. I'm learning how to do this.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's a very important project. Really glad to hear that Douglas Gayeton is involved. His work is brilliant.
It is. He's a
It's a very
masterful.
powerful form of communication, and it's a wonderful supplement to what you're doing there.
Well, and I think, Douglas has taught me a tremendous amount in this whole process. And I think, he's also got lots of lessons for this kind of activism that we need to see happen.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
realizing that, as he says, we have to be platform agnostic. We have to find ways to get these messages and stories out there in every form possible. And, when you do something like a pop-up show, suddenly it becomes not just a talk or a presentation. It becomes a point of opportunity for people to gather, to
Mm.
start to have the conversation and
Yeah.
scratch our heads together, kind of in concert. So,
Right. Good.
yeah. So.
Well, before we sign off, I'll just ask you if you have a message or something that you'd like to say to the audience tuning in to the Local Food Summit. Parting shot.
Sure. Well, I think one of the revelations for me, Michael, going around and doing the book tour with Rebuilding the Food Shed, I wish you could do the book tours before you wrote the book.
Yeah.
You learn so much as you go around, and I'd be interested to hear what Jack Kloppenberg and others have to say here. But, I struggled as an academic to try to define food sheds and really to understand what that was, or if I wanted to put my stake in the ground. And eventually I decided that I would put a little bit of a stake in the ground. And so after talking to these different communities, you and others who are doing such great work, at this point, I think about the food shed really is the periphery of our influence to create positive change.
Mm.
And that's enough for me, just understanding where that is. And sometimes those, that periphery expands as we go, but it's about understanding the core of our community, who we are, and how
Yes.
we can move forward. And I know you and others there are so wedded to that. And it's an awesome thing to see. I feel like there's a lot of hope. We don't have to look at the news all the time. We need to be looking at the local food summit, getting the stories.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Philip, for being part of this. And hopefully during the 10 days of the summit, we'll be able to bring you in live at some point to interact with some of the audience. We'll work on that.
I'd love to do that. That would be
Okay.
really fun. Hear what other folks are thinking and saying.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Really a pleasure. Best to everyone there, and good luck with everything.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.